Merry Christmas and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Michael Sheen takes a journey through time when he boards the last train to Christmas. On Christmas Eve 1985, nightclub owner and local celebrity Tony Towers, played by Michael Sheen, gets on the London to Nottingham train with his much younger fiancée, Sue, played by Nathalie Emmanuel, and soon joined by his younger brother Roger, played by Cary Elwes. But when Tony walks into the next carriage forwards, he's transported to 1995 and discovers that he's lost everything. He soon realises that he's in a time warp where each carriage takes him forward or backward a decade, and Tony only has the length of the journey to try and fix his future. But the more he changes, the worse things get for him and those around him. Last Train to Christmas is written, directed by Julian Kemp, who is a veteran television director in the UK. In fact, his last feature film, My Last Five Girlfriends, which starred Naomi Harris, was released over a decade ago. Now, this is a Sky Cinema original in the UK. It's one of 3 original films they have for Christmas this year, including A Boy Called Christmas and A Christmas Number 1. This is the last of the set, and it seems like everywhere now is getting into the original Christmas movie game, following in the footsteps of Lifetime and Hallmark, who have long filled out their schedules with paint-by-numbers generic Christmas romances. But because every streamer and channel now has to compete with each other, you have a huge demand for these movies, and certainly among audiences, the demand for Christmas movies is insatiable. If something has Christmas in the title, they will watch it. In fact, there was recently a news story about how IMDb claimed there were over 200 movies set for release in 2021 that had the word Christmas in the title. Not just Christmas movies, oh no, just movies that simply had Christmas in the title. The actual number of Christmas movies is probably even higher than that. So that only goes to show that there is a huge lucrative audience for Christmas films. And I will say that Last Train to Christmas and its premise really got my attention. That's one of the reasons why I'm reviewing this, and also because I think it's a cut above the usual Christmas movie fare. If this train stops at your station, you should definitely hop on board. Last Train to Christmas was probably pitched as A Christmas Carol meets Back to the Future, and the influence of the latter can definitely be felt on the fact that the movie starts off in 1985, the same year that movie was released and set in. And while this is definitely a reworking of a lot of the themes of A Christmas Carol, this is not a straight-up retelling like you often see at this time of year. This is an original story with a similar time warp narrative. For example, Michael Sheen's Tony Towers, he's not a miser, he doesn't despise Christmas, but he is a greedy and selfish man, and definitely self-absorbed in a lot of ways. And this definitely seems like a part that just screams out to Michael Sheen, because it's the kind of role that has him in a lot of different costumes and wigs. It's an extremely wiggy performance. The first time that we see him in this movie, he struts on with this massive peacocking blonde mullet, and that is just the first of many different looks that Tony goes through over the course of this movie. Every time he steps into a different decade or a different carriage, his appearance changes, and even through the movie in different decades, according to what's happening to his character, he looks different. So there's a whole multitude of looks for Michael Sheen in this movie, and he's clearly enjoying getting to just play dress up to a certain extent. There's a very Alan Partridge-y version of the character in an alternate 1985. There's a version of him that looks a lot like Peter Stringfellow in the 2000s. Like, there's various different iterations that are clearly based on different figures over history that he's replacing over the course of it. And so that's kind of fun. And you can tell that Michael Sheen is enjoying himself. It's a role that gets him to stretch both his comedic and his dramatic muscles, because not only does he get to look absolutely ridiculous through great chunks of this movie, but he also sells the dramatic side as well, because as we know, Sheen is a fantastic actor. He's always one of those performers that is incredibly watchable, and having him at the centre of your movie really is a massive plus, especially because I think he helps guide the film through a lot of its problems and elevates it. The script definitely has a lot of tonal shifts it needs to navigate as it moves between decades, and I think in the hands of a much less performer, that could have been a lot more jarring. But because Sheen Sheen can move so deftly between comedy and drama, even within the same extended scene, he actually manages to keep the movie on track. And I think this is a real showcase for his talent, because he's in so much of this movie. He's in about 80% of it, and the character only gets recast in his youngest years in the 60s, 50s, and 40s. So Sheen really is the central focus the majority of the time. He's not a bad man. He's just one that doesn't really know what he actually wants. He thinks he wants to be successful. He thinks he wants to be famous, but actually he doesn't really need any of those things, and wanting those things causes harm to him and everyone else. That's what he needs to learn over the course of this journey. And I did think at first that this movie was actually going to centre upon his relationship with Sue, played by Nathalie Emmanuel, who is best known for her role in the Fast and Furious series, because obviously she's a much younger woman, and so there's this tension there where Tony starts to get a little bit suspect about her and wonder if she is actually going to be the one that undoes him in a lot of ways, that actually she's not in love with him at all, she's purely in love with his success and what that represents. But it's clear in Emmanuel's performance that she cares about him, not about his status, and I think that's made abundantly clear in their final scene together, which is a fairly lengthy moment towards the end of the movie that allows the actors' chemistry to really shine. You understand how these two characters got together, even if it's not the version that we see at the beginning of the movie. Unfortunately, Emmanuel actually disappears out of this movie after the first act. There's a very long gap before she reappears again, because the movie literally loses her, and I think it loses something in the process. Here, I would have liked to have seen a bit more screen time for her. What the movie actually reveals itself to be is more of a family drama, because Cary Elwes, as Tony's brother Roger, actually is the central conflict of the movie, in that the two brothers, they've never quite got along, and while Tony is kind of successful as a nightclub manager, he's trying to do too much. He's trying to be too big. At the beginning of the movie, he wants to open 6 nightclubs at once, and Roger's the one that's telling him, no, actually, just open one. But Tony is resentful at Roger for being arguably more successful than he is. Tony likes to puff up his celebrity, but Roger has the more profitable, if unshowy, role being a designer of audio equipment like speakers and stereos. And so this brotherly dynamic actually becomes central to the movie, especially once Tony starts making changes, because that has a dramatic effect on Roger and his personality. And I think that Elwes is perhaps the one that most impressed me here, because not only does he have to play Roger at different points in his life, but he also has to play different incarnations of Roger as well, because the Roger we meet at the beginning of the movie is not the one that we have in the middle of it, who is more of this punk rocker that is getting increasingly more self-destructive and disheveled over the course of the timeline. And Elwes certainly commits to being grotesque, especially in the 90s sequence where he's got these rotting teeth inserted in. It is a big performance, but it has to be in order to compete with Sheen. But certainly I think that when the movie calls for him to tone it down somewhat and to really get across how heartbreaking and just how awful this situation is, you can also feel it. And I think it reminds you again of just how good Elwes is as a performer, mixing comedy and drama in much the same way that Sheen is. The movie also has a lot of fun with its casting in general. It's the kind of movie that drops in a recognisable British character actor just for a scene, like John Thompson from Cold Feet appears for just one scene in an alternate version of 1985. In fact, the time travel conceit even goes further, because the film deliberately courts nostalgia by casting older British actors that we haven't necessarily seen a lot on screen recently in supporting roles. So Robin Asquith, best known as the lead in the 70s sex comedy Confession series, pops up as a director in an alternate 1985 guiding Tony through an advert. But perhaps the biggest coup of all is a very fleeting appearance from Hayley Mills playing Tony's mother in 2005. It's only for a very few fleeting moments, but even so, it's just surprising that they've managed to get in these huge names for essentially cameo appearances here. Now, the big difference between this and A Christmas Carol is that when Scrooge went back in time, he was merely an observer. He couldn't change the past. That's definitely not true for Last Train to Christmas, and this is where I think the movie is going to start dividing audiences, because a lot of the audience for Christmas movies, they want something simple and lightweight that they can throw on in the background. They don't have to give it their first attention, but just something pleasant while they do their Christmas chores. And Last Train to Christmas was not designed to be viewed that way. This is a movie that demands you to pay attention to it, as it leans into its time travel conceit, which is genuinely inspired. It's an idea that sounds simple at first, but starts getting complex very quickly. But if you like Back to the Future Part 2, that's alternate 1985, and you can follow all that perfectly, then you should have a good time with this. I like Back to the Future Part 2, and I like the fact that the time travel stuff really gets played around with there. But I can also understand another audience member that will be completely lost by it, and I think the same thing will happen here. Even though the movie tries to guide you through it, I do think that it might fly over people who aren't fully invested in it, because honestly, it does have the kind of plotting you would normally see in a Doctor Who Christmas special. The way that the time travel works in this movie is that obviously they're on the train and it's going to its set destination of Nottingham, so it has a ticking clock, as it were, where all this takes place in, but also there is no way of fixing anything that Tony has changed over the course of it. The train is moving, essentially, so if he screws up in the past, he can't go back further and fix it. He merely has to try and correct it from that point forwards, if you see what I mean. And if you understand that, then you should be able to understand the principles of the plotting and how Tony can change something in the past and then he walks forward into a completely different future, and then he can take things from the future and try and alter the past, and it makes things even worse. And so I mentioned Back to the Future 2 very heavily. It's also because the tone here is very similar in that it gets quite dark. His changes literally erase people from the timeline, and that is horrifying. And I think that Kemp understands that the point of A Christmas Carol story, it has to be uplifting, but it needs that darkness beforehand, because Scrooge needs to be shown the consequences of his actions and thinking, and how that impacts on everyone around him for the negative, and Tony gets that manyfold over the course of this. But of course, that also means that the movie is maybe not the cheeriest of Christmas films, even if there is a lot of fun in seeing the various different permutations and timelines, because there's not just one version of 1985, there's at least 3 different incarnations of 1985, so you better keep track. But helping the viewer along is the absolutely phenomenal production design, which is first rate. This was the part that really impressed me about the movie, because on the technical side, they are really working their butts off, because not only do they have to do different periods over the course of the movie, they have to do different versions of those periods as well. So you've got different train carriages, numerous costume changes, props, period detail, all rolled into one, and the movie does a remarkable job of it. I'm sure the fact that it's largely self-contained on the train helps with that in a lot of ways, and certainly there's a lot of name drops in the script to various brands and things that have fallen out of fashion or have gone bankrupt, which again plays upon the nostalgia of older audiences who remember when those brands existed. And while the film is locked to that single train location, because there are so many different set dressings and alterations over the course of the movie, and the fact that it looks different with each passing era, it always feels like there's something going on. It never feels like it's static. It always feels like it's evolving over the course of its narrative. And to guide the viewer through the different eras, there are different aspect ratios depending on what time period you're looking at. So the scenes in the 80s are in 4:3 and have a tape effect applied to them, like we're seeing it recorded on VHS. The scenes in the 70s are in full 16:9. There are other chunks of the movie that are in 1:8:5. The 60s segment and the ending in 2025 are in 2:35:1, and the scenes in the 1950s and the 1940s are also in 4:3 respectively, and the scene in the 1940s is actually in black and white. And that doesn't just apply to the visuals, that also refers to the soundscape as well. And I'm not just talking about the licensed soundtrack, which obviously reflects the eras that each particular sequence is set in. I'm talking about the sound, particularly in the 50s and 40s segments, where it has that kind of hissy, shrill kind of quality that you would expect from the soundtrack of a movie from that period that was recorded onto vinyl. And so that is a lot more attention to detail than you would genuinely expect out of a streaming movie. It's so subtle, and yet you can get the sense that they're really enjoying having a playfulness with all the different eras that are on screen. And I think the 50s and 40s segments are perhaps the most interesting out of all of them, because it feels like the aesthetic of the movie has been deliberately designed to evoke films made during that specific era, and this is very highly effective at the climax of the movie in the 40s, where if you hadn't seen the rest of the movie and you just saw that segment just all by itself, you'd think you were watching an Ealing film from the 1940s, and that is a really high compliment. The attention to detail and the way that it's simply shot with a lot of very stark close-ups, particularly insert shots, it's very, very well done. I think for a movie like this, it genuinely compares to much bigger budget fare like Last Night in Soho. That's how good the production design here is. My main complaint about the movie is that it falls at the very last hurdle. The final sequence of the movie is, in my opinion, a misfire. You would think there would only be one logical place for this movie to conclude, which is 1985, or at least a version of it, so we can see Tony's changes in full effect and bring us back full circle. And instead the movie doesn't do that. The very final sequence is really kind of puzzling in terms of decisions, not least of which because it tries to go for a low-key emotional ending. And honestly, I don't think that works because it ends up being vague and undefined, especially with regards to the fates of key supporting characters like Roger and Sue. We do get a little bit of information about what has happened to them, but not nearly enough, and it focuses more on Tony's sense of completion than all three characters, as it really should do. And I think that the characters that are lost in the time travel element aren't really given their proper closure at the end of the movie. It feels like the film is resisting the urge to have a big sentimental finish. And that's really what it should have. It should have a big reunion at the end of it to give us that proper emotional catharsis and bring all the threads together so that even the audience members that kind of got lost in the mechanics of it all, at least they are back on board at the end of the movie. They understand the movie emotionally, if not through the minutiae of its plotting, and instead the film rejects that when really it is crying out for that kind of finish and really bring it to that positive, uplifting place that a movie like this should do. I found Last Train to Christmas to be an unexpected surprise. surprise. It's genuinely clever, it's got fun performances from Michael Sheen and Cary Elwes, and there's an absolute slew of period detail. The production design makes this so much fun to watch. It's not a perfect movie, and in fact, it's quite a flawed one. I do think it gets a little bit overly knotted in its time travel mechanics to the detriment of its story and its characters, and I think that will put off some viewers that want something a bit more straightforward. But I also found this to be surprisingly rewarding in certain ways, and I at least respect a Christmas movie that tries to be ambitious. Far too many recent Christmas films are basically getting a bunch of name actors in a house and they bicker with each other, and if I wanted to see that, I just watch my own family at Christmas. That doesn't make me feel festive in any way, whereas this, I think, is much closer to what a Christmas movie should be, and also feels just that right kind of magical. And I don't think this is going to be a Christmas classic by any stretch, but if you give it a chance, it might end up slipping into some people's Christmas rotation. If you like this review though, you can buy me a ticket over at my Ko-fi page, or you can reach your final destination over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. Have a safe and happy Christmas.